Picture this: a beautiful girl in a shimmering blue gown, glass slippers sparkling in the moonlight, dancing with a handsome prince, while mice sing cheerfully in the background. This is the Cinderella you know, the one Disney painted in pastels and magic, complete with a fairy godmother who makes dreams come true with a wave of her wand. Now forget everything you just imagined. The real Cinderella story, the one recorded by the Brothers Grimm in 1812, doesn't feature glass slippers at all. It features shoes soaked in blood from stepsisters who sliced off their toes and heels with a knife, desperate to marry a prince who couldn't tell one woman from another. There's no singing mice, no magical pumpkin carriage, and definitely no fairy godmother with a heart of gold. Instead, there's a young woman covered in ashes from cleaning fireplaces, living as an unpaid slave in her own home, surviving in a medieval world where women were property to be bought, sold, and disposed of at will. The original Cinderella wasn't a love story, it was a survival manual for abused women living in societies where they had no legal rights, no protection, and no escape except through strategic endurance and underground networks of other desperate women. You grew up with a lie. The real Cinderella is absolutely terrifying. The Brothers Grimm weren't collecting fairy tales for children's bedtime stories. They were documenting the social reality of medieval Europe, where child labour was legal, domestic abuse was normalised, and women's bodies were considered commodities in marriage markets. Every detail Disney removed tells us something horrifying about how our ancestors actually lived. The glass slipper that seems so romantic? It was originally made of gold, and the blood seeping through it served as a test of how much physical mutilation women would endure for a chance at economic security. The midnight curfew that seems like magical whimsy? It reflects actual legal restrictions that controlled women's movement and kept them literally powerless after dark. The stepmother, who seems cartoonishly evil, she was operating within a legal system that gave her unlimited authority over inherited children, including the right to use them as unpaid labour or sell them into servitude. You're about to discover that every romantic element Disney added to Cinderella was covering up documented historical practices of child abuse, human trafficking, and the systematic oppression of women. The original story wasn't about finding true love, it was about a young woman using whatever limited tools she had to escape a system designed to destroy her. In the Brothers Grimm version of Cinderella, when the prince arrives with the mysterious shoe, something horrifying happens that Disney would never show children. The first stepsister takes the golden slipper into her bedroom, sits on her bed, and deliberately cuts off her big toe with a sharp knife. Blood pours from her foot, but she forces the mangled extremity into the shoe and limps out to present herself to the prince as his bride. The prince, apparently unable to recognize faces, accepts this bloody, limping woman as his intended wife and rides away with her. Only when birds start singing, "There's blood in the shoe," does he bother to look down and notice the trail of blood dripping from her foot. He returns her to the house and asks for the next daughter. The second stepsister, having witnessed her sister's failed attempt, decides to cut off her heel instead. Again, blood fills the golden shoe. Again, she presents herself as the prince's bride. Again, the prince accepts her until the birds point out the obvious bloodshed he somehow missed. This wasn't the Brothers Grimm inventing gothic horror for shock value. They were recording a story that reflected real medieval practices around marriage, desperation, and women's bodies. In medieval Europe, marriage was the only path to economic security for most women. Without access to education, property ownership, or independent income, a woman's survival depended entirely on finding a husband who could provide for her. The alternative was often destitution, prostitution, or death. Medieval marriage contracts were essentially business transactions between men, with women's bodies serving as the commodity being exchanged. Fathers negotiated dowries, inheritance rights, and breeding agreements. The bride's physical condition, fertility prospects, and even specific body measurements could be included in these contracts. Historical records from across medieval Europe document cases of families going to extreme lengths to make their daughters marriageable. Foot binding wasn't limited to China. Archaeological evidence shows deliberate foot deformation was practiced in various European regions to create smaller, more desirable feet. Corsets were tightened to the point of rib displacement and organ damage to achieve fashionable waist measurements. Court records from 14th century France describe a case where a noble family had their daughter's teeth filed to points because pointed teeth were considered attractive in their region. When fashion trends changed, they had her teeth filed flat again. The documentation matter-of-factly notes that the daughter died from infection following the second procedure. But the most disturbing connection to the Cinderella story comes from medieval Germanic regions, where the brothers Grimm collected their tales. Archaeological excavations of medieval burial sites have uncovered female skeletons showing evidence of deliberate toe amputation and foot mutilation. Carbon dating places these burials during periods when small feet were considered essential for marriage prospects. Medieval medical texts describe procedures for foot modification, including toe removal, arch manipulation, and heel reduction. These weren't medical treatments for injuries, they were cosmetic surgeries performed to meet marriage market demands. The procedures were often performed by barber surgeons using crude tools and no anesthesia. What makes the Cinderella stepsisters' mutilation even more chilling is the casual way the story presents it. There's no dramatic debate about whether to cut off body parts. The stepsisters simply accept that physical mutilation is a reasonable price to pay for marriage to a wealthy man. This reflects how normalized such desperation had become in societies where women had no alternative paths to survival. The golden shoe itself carries symbolic weight beyond its practical function. Gold was associated with purity, wealth, and divine favor in medieval symbolism. A golden shoe filled with blood creates a deliberate contrast between appearance and reality, between the promised rewards of marriage and the actual cost women paid to achieve it. The prince's inability to notice blood pouring from his bride's foot reveals another disturbing truth about medieval marriage practices. Husbands weren't expected to know their wives personally, to recognize their faces, or to care about their physical well-being. Marriage was a property transfer, not a personal relationship. The prince's blindness to his bride's suffering reflects how systematically medieval society trained men to ignore women's pain. The blood-soaked shoe serves as a test, but not of love or destiny. It's a test of how much mutilation women would endure for economic security, and how much suffering men would ignore to complete a marriage transaction. When birds in the story point out the blood, they're serving as witnesses something medieval women rarely had when they suffered abuse or mutilation. The birds represent the community awareness that was often the only protection available to women, though even that protection was unreliable and often came too late. The original Cinderella story was teaching medieval women that finding a husband might require literal bloodshed, that their physical integrity was less important than their marriage prospects, and that even obvious suffering might be overlooked by the men who claimed to rescue them. Cinderella's name reveals the most horrifying truth about her story. She wasn't called Cinderella because she was clumsy around fireplaces, or because she had a poetic connection to ashes. She was called Cinderella because she was forced to sleep in the cinders covered in ash, like the thousands of child labourers who worked in medieval industries and lived in conditions that would kill most adults within months. In the Brothers Grimm version, Cinderella's father is alive and present in the household. He watches his daughter being reduced to servant status by his new wife. He sees her sleeping in the kitchen ashes, wearing rags, and performing dangerous manual labour. He does nothing to protect her because medieval law gave step-parents unlimited authority over inherited children, including the right to use them as unpaid labour. This wasn't unusual, it was standard practice across medieval Europe. When a parent remarried, children from previous marriages became economic assets for the new family unit. They could be put to work, rented out to other households, or even sold into longer-term servitude contracts. Legal codes from medieval Germanic regions specifically address the rights of step-parents to extract labour from inherited children. Medieval household account books, preserved in various European archives, document the systematic exploitation of these children. Stepchildren were assigned the most dangerous tasks: maintaining fires, handling hot metals, cleaning chimneys, and working with toxic materials. Their deaths were recorded as accidents, but the frequency suggests deliberate placement in life-threatening situations. The ash that covered Cinderella connects her to a specific type of medieval child labour: cinder, raking in coal and charcoal production. Children as young as 6 were forced to work in coal yards, constantly covered in ash and breathing toxic fumes. Their life expectancy was measured in months, not years. Surviving records from English and German coal operations show that children in these jobs rarely lived past adolescence. Archaeological evidence supports these historical accounts. Excavations of medieval industrial sites have uncovered small skeletons showing signs of respiratory disease, malnutrition, and chemical burns consistent with ash and coal exposure. Many of these remains show evidence of bone deformation caused by carrying heavy loads while still growing. But Cinderella's situation represents an even more insidious form of child abuse: domestic slavery disguised as family structure. Unlike industrial child labourers who were openly acknowledged as workers, domestic servant children like Cinderella existed in a legal grey area where their exploitation was hidden within household privacy. Medieval marriage contracts sometimes included provisions about children from previous marriages. These provisions rarely protected the children instead. They clarified how step-parents could extract value from them. Some contracts explicitly stated that stepchildren would provide domestic labour until they reached legal adulthood, which could be as late as 25 years old. The dangers Cinderella faced as a domestic servant were life-threatening in ways modern readers don't understand. Medieval kitchens were death traps filled with open flames, boiling liquids, sharp tools, and toxic cleaning materials. Child servants regularly died from burns, cuts, poisoning, and smoke inhalation. These deaths were rarely investigated because servant children had no legal protection. Court records from medieval France document cases of stepchildren who died under suspicious circumstances while performing domestic labour. One case from 1347 describes a 12-year-old girl who died after being forced to clean a chimney. The stepmother claimed the child fell, but witnesses testified that she had been pushed into the chimney as punishment for breaking a dish. The original Cinderella story includes details that connect directly to these historical realities. Cinderella's stepfamily forces her to sort peas and lentils from ashes stasks that exposed children to respiratory damage while providing no nutritional benefit to the workers. She's denied adequate food, clothing, and shelter while performing labor that generates income for the household. What makes Cinderella's situation even more horrific is the psychological abuse embedded in her treatment. She's forced to witness her stepsisters receiving the care, education, and resources that should have been hers as a legitimate member of the household. This deliberate contrast was designed to break her spirit and ensure compliance with her servant status. Medieval chroniclers rarely documented the emotional impact of child exploitation because children's psychological well-being wasn't considered important. But the Cinderella story preserves details that reveal the systematic nature of this abuse: the isolation from social contact, the denial of proper clothing that would allow her to appear in public, and the constant reinforcement that she was worth less than her stepsisters. The fairy tale's focus on Cinderella's patience and endurance reflects medieval survival strategies for abused children. Direct resistance could result in worse punishment or death, so exploited children learned to endure, to find small ways to help themselves, and to wait for opportunities to escape. When Cinderella receives help from supernatural sources, she's accessing the same networks that real medieval servant children used to survive. Other women who understood their situation and could provide limited assistance. The fairy godmother figure represents older women who had survived similar exploitation and could offer practical help to younger victims. The original story was teaching medieval audiences that child abuse was so normalized that even biological fathers would allow it to continue, that legal systems offered no protection for vulnerable children, and that survival required strategic endurance rather than heroic resistance. The midnight deadline that drives Disney's most famous scene, Cinderella, racing down palace steps as her carriage transforms back into a pumpkin, wasn't magical whimsy. It was a reflection of actual legal restrictions that controlled women's movement and rendered them powerless after dark in medieval society. Across medieval Europe, curfew laws specifically targeted unmarried women, requiring them to be indoors and under male supervision by specific evening hours. These laws weren't about public safety, they were about social control. Women found outside after curfew could be arrested, fined, or worse. Medieval court records from England, France, and Germanic regions document thousands of cases of women punished for curfew violations. The punishments were deliberately severe: public whipping, branding, imprisonment, or forced marriage to men willing to take responsibility for controlling them. The legal principle was clear: women who couldn't control themselves needed to be controlled by men. In the original Brothers Grimm version, Cinderella's midnight deadline isn't imposed by fairy godmother magicians, imposed by her stepfamily, who use it to limit her access to social opportunities that might lead to independence. This reflects actual household practices where step-parents and guardians used curfews to prevent servant children from forming relationships that could help them escape. But the midnight curse represents something even more sinister: the medieval legal concept of coverture, which made women legally invisible after marriage. At midnight, the traditional transition between one day and the next, Cinderella's temporary transformation into a lady ends, and she returns to her invisible servant status. Medieval sumptuary laws controlled not just when women could appear in public, but how they could appear. These laws regulated clothing, jewelry, hairstyling, and even posture based on social class. Women who dressed above their station could be legally stripped, whipped, and imprisoned. Cinderella's magical transformation violates these laws, making her midnight deadline a literal life-or-death escape from legal punishment. Historical records document cases of women severely punished for sumptuary violations. In 1379, a French court record describes a servant woman who wore her mistress's dress to church. She was publicly stripped, whipped through the streets, and branded on the forehead to mark her as someone who had violated clothing laws. The transformation magic in Cinderella's story reflects the precarious nature of women's social mobility in medieval society. Any improvement in status was temporary, conditional, and could be revoked instantly. Women who attempted to rise above their assigned social position faced systematic punishment designed to reinforce their powerlessness. Medieval marriage laws included provisions that could instantly strip women of any property, status, or independence they had achieved. A woman who inherited wealth could lose it immediately upon marriage, as all her assets became her husband's property. This legal transformation was as dramatic and complete as any fairy tale magic. The pumpkin carriage itself carries symbolic weight beyond its obvious magical elements. Pumpkins were associated with deception and false appearances in medieval folklore. A pumpkin carriage represents transportation that looks substantial but lacks real foundation, exactly like the temporary social mobility available to medieval women. Real medieval transportation for women was heavily regulated. Unmarried women needed male permission to travel, even short distances. They couldn't own horses, hire transportation, or travel alone without risking legal punishment. Cinderella's magical carriage represents the fantasy of independent movement that was legally impossible for most medieval women. The transformation of mice into horses adds another layer of social commentary. Mice were considered vermin, the lowest form of animal life. Their transformation into noble horses reflects how medieval society could temporarily elevate the powerless, but only through systems controlled by those with real authority. Medieval court records describe actual cases of women using disguises and false identities to attend social events where they weren't welcome. These women faced severe punishment when discovered, including imprisonment, exile, or forced marriage to men willing to control them. Cinderella's disguise represents the real risks women took to access social opportunities. The glass slipper left behind at midnight serves as evidence of Cinderella's curfew violation. In medieval legal proceedings, physical evidence of women's rule-breaking was used to justify harsh punishments. A shoe left at a forbidden location could be used in court to prove a woman had violated travel restrictions. The prince's search for the slipper's owner represents medieval legal procedures for tracking down women who had violated social regulations. Authorities would conduct house-to-house searches, force women to submit to physical examinations, and use any available evidence to identify and punish rule breakers. The midnight deadline teaches medieval women that any taste of freedom or social mobility was temporary, that they existed at the mercy of systems designed to control them, and that returning to powerlessness was inevitable unless they found a man willing to transfer ownership of them from one household to another. The curse that returned Cinderella to her servant status at midnight wasn't supernatural, it was the natural functioning of a society that systematically prevented women from achieving lasting independence or security through their own efforts. The most disturbing element of the original Cinderella story isn't the blood-soaked shoes or the child abuse, it's what the prince's behaviour reveals about medieval marriage practices. This isn't a man searching for his true love. This is a property inspection disguised as romance. The prince dances with Cinderella for hours at the ball, speaks with her, holds her hand, looks into her eyes. Yet when she disappears at midnight, he cannot identify her by sight. He doesn't know her name, her voice, her face, or any personal detail about her. His only means of finding her is a physical object that measures part of her body. This wasn't storytelling incompetence by the Brothers Grimm. It was an accurate reflection of how medieval marriage worked. Men shopping for wives based on physical specifications, not personal relationships. Medieval marriage contracts included detailed physical descriptions of brides, often measured and documented like livestock purchases. Height, weight, bust and waist measurements, hair colour, skin condition, and foot size were all recorded as part of marriage negotiations. Some contracts included provisions for returning defective wives who didn't match their documented specifications. The foot measurement held particular significance in medieval marriage markets. Small feet indicated that a woman hadn't performed manual labour, suggesting she came from a wealthy family. Foot size was also believed to correlate with the size of other body parts, making it a crude method for evaluating reproductive potential and sexual compatibility. Court records from medieval Germanic regions document actual cases of princes and nobles conducting bride searches using physical measurements. In 1389, a German count reportedly tested over 200 women using a specific ring size, seeking a bride whose finger-matched measurements he considered ideal. The woman who fit became his wife, despite never having spoken to him. What makes the prince's search even more dehumanizing is his apparent inability to recognize Cinderella's voice, mannerisms, or personality. Medieval legal codes treated married women as property transfers, where the husband gained complete ownership of the woman's body, labour, and any children she produced. Personal compatibility was irrelevant to these transactions. The slipper test represents the medieval practice of physical inspection before marriage contracts were finalized. Prospective brides were examined by physicians or experienced women to verify their virginity, health, and breeding potential. These examinations were documented and could invalidate marriage agreements if the bride didn't meet specifications. Historical records from noble European households describe bride inspections that included dental examinations, posture analysis, gait evaluation, and detailed gynecological examinations. Women who failed these inspections could be rejected, returned to their families in disgrace, or forced into less advantageous marriages. The stepsisters' willingness to mutilate their feet reflects the desperation of women competing in markets where their bodies were their only assets. Medieval women understood that failing to meet physical specifications could mean lifelong poverty, social exclusion, or death. Self-mutilation was a rational response to impossible circumstances. But here's what's most chilling about the prince's methodology. He accepts any woman whose foot fits the slipper, regardless of obvious evidence that something is wrong. When the stepsisters present themselves with bleeding, mutilated feet, he initially accepts them as his bride. This reflects medieval legal principles that gave husbands ownership rights over women's bodies, including the right to damage or modify them. Medieval marriage laws explicitly transferred ownership of women from fathers to husbands. The bride's consent wasn't required, only the agreement between the men involved in the transaction. Women were expected to submit to whatever physical or sexual demands their husbands made, including practices that caused injury or disfigurement. The prince's inability to distinguish between different women who fit his physical criteria reflects how interchangeable wives were in medieval society. Husbands could replace wives who died, became disabled, or failed to produce children. The specific identity of the woman was less important than her ability to fulfill the functions of a wife, domestic labor, sexual availability, and child production. When Cinderella finally fits the slipper perfectly, the prince's immediate acceptance of her as his bride demonstrates medieval attitudes toward marriage consent. He doesn't ask if she wants to marry him, doesn't inquire about her feelings or preferences, and doesn't seem concerned about the dramatic difference between her current appearance and how she looked at the ball. The perfect fit represents medieval ideals about wives as custom-designed property. Husbands wanted wives who met their exact specifications and would conform perfectly to their household's needs. A wife who required modification or adjustment was considered defective. Medieval wedding ceremonies reflected these property transfer principles. Brides were given away by fathers to husbands in ceremonies that legally transferred ownership. The bride's role was to submit to this transfer, not to consent to it as an equal participant. The happy ending of Cinderella, where she rides away with the prince to live happily ever after, masks the reality that she's simply being transferred from one form of servitude to another. As the prince's wife, she'll have more luxury but no more legal rights than she had as her stepfamily's servant. Medieval legal codes made wives subordinate to husbands in every aspect of life. Husbands could control their wives' movement, social contact, clothing, religious practices, and access to money. They could physically punish wives for disobedience and had exclusive rights to any children the marriage produced. The original Cinderella story was teaching medieval women that marriage was their only escape from one form of powerlessness, but that escape led directly to another form of powerlessness. The prince's search represents the evaluation process that women had to survive to achieve the limited security that marriage provided. The shoe test reveals medieval society's reduction of women to physical specifications and functions, where personal identity, intelligence, emotions, and preferences were irrelevant to their value as wives and mothers. When you strip away Disney's magic and romance, the original Cinderella emerges as one of history's most sophisticated guides to surviving systematic oppression. Every element that seems cruel or bizarre in the Brothers Grimm version served as practical instruction for women living in societies designed to destroy them. The blood-soaked shoes taught women that finding security might require literal sacrifice of their bodies. The ash-covered servitude taught them that abuse was normalized and legal protection was non-existent. The midnight curfew taught them that any freedom they achieved would be temporary and conditional. The prince's commodity inspection taught them that even their rescue would reduce them to property. But hidden within these dark lessons was something more subversive, a survival strategy. Cinderella endures abuse without breaking. She finds allies in supernatural sources, representing the underground networks of women who helped each other survive. She uses intelligence and strategic thinking to navigate impossible situations. She maintains her dignity and identity despite systematic attempts to erase both. Most importantly, she waits for the right opportunity and seizes it when it comes. The original fairy tale was teaching medieval women that survival required patience, cunning, and the ability to recognize when circumstances offered brief windows of escape. It taught them to build networks with other women, to maintain hope despite overwhelming oppression, and to prepare for chances that might come only once in a lifetime. The transformation magic represents something real. The dramatic changes that could occur when women found ways to escape their circumstances. But it also carried a warning. These transformations were fragile, temporary, and dependent on forces beyond women's control. Medieval women understood that the story's happy ending was itself a kind of fantasy. Marriage to a prince might offer security, but it wouldn't offer freedom. Cinderella's escape from her stepfamily's abuse led directly to a different form of controlled existence as royal property. The fairy tale preserved this contradiction because it reflected the impossible choices real women faced: remain in obvious abuse or accept a more comfortable form of subordination. But for women trapped in situations with no good options, Cinderella offered something invaluable: proof that survival was possible, that abuse didn't have to be permanent, and that even the most powerless person could find ways to endure until circumstances changed. The birds that warn the prince about blood in the shoes represent the community awareness that sometimes protected women when official systems failed them. The helpers who sought Cinderella's tasks represent the small acts of assistance that women provided each other in desperate situations. Even the stepfamily's cruelty serves an instructional purpose, showing readers how to recognize abusive patterns, how to survive them psychologically, and how to maintain hope for eventual escape. Disney's transformation of this survival manual into a romance story reveals how uncomfortable we remain with acknowledging the historical reality of women's systematic oppression. By making the story about finding true love, we avoid confronting the documented evidence of how recently women were treated as property. But the original Cinderella isn't really about the past, it's about understanding systems of power that still exist in modified forms. It's about recognizing how societies normalize abuse by disguising it as tradition, how economic desperation drives people to accept unacceptable treatment, and how the powerless develop strategies for survival that the powerful prefer not to see. The real Cinderella story teaches us that fairy tales were never meant to comfort children with happy endings. They were meant to prepare women for harsh realities while showing them that survival, dignity, and even escape were possible for those smart enough, patient enough, and lucky enough to seize their opportunities. The Glass Slipper was never about finding true love. It was about understanding that in a world where women are reduced to their physical specifications, intelligence and endurance matter more than beauty, and that sometimes the only way out is through. Every time someone tells you a Disney fairy tale, remember, you're hearing a sanitized version of a survival guide, written in blood, ash, and the tears of women who fought to live another day. The real Cinderella isn't terrifying because it's fictional. It's terrifying because every brutal detail reflects documented historical reality. And the most terrifying part of all? How much of that reality still exists today, just dressed in prettier packaging